Welcome to Chess Dog. I'm John Montgomery, and today we have a video with the no endgame promise, the no endgame seal of approval. Now, I know endgames can sometimes be interesting. Endgames are very valuable for becoming a stronger chess player, but sometimes you just want to play over a game that's tear the king apart. And this game of Magnus Carlsen's against Grandmaster Ernst does exactly that. Magnus has the white pieces, Grandmaster Ernst has the black. Carlsen starts with e4, c6, d4, d5, the Caro-Kann, knight c3, de4, knight e4, the mainline Caro-Kann. And I know what some of you are thinking. A mainline Caro-Kann plus Magnus Carlsen is the perfect recipe for a long endgame grind. But I promise you that's not what happens here. This is a great attacking game. Bishop f5, the bishop is developed, knight g3, bishop g6, h4, threatening to trap the bishop with h5, h6, knight to f3. The knight threatens to go to e5 and put pressure on that bishop on g6. Black responds knight to d7 to help control the e5 square. White plays h5, gains that space, bishop h7, bishop d3, queen d3. Now, black has exchanged off his bad light squared bishop, and white has a lead in development, and those are the imbalances we're dealing with here. e6, bishop f4, white targets that weak d6 square, knight g f6, white castles long, bishop e7, knight to e4. So black moves the knight at g3 to e4, puts more pressure on d6, and also frees that g pawn up so that pawn could be used in an attack later. Black plays queen to a5, hitting the pawn on a2 and the pawn on h5. King to b1, defending the pawn on a2. Black goes ahead and castles. Knight h5 is technically playable, but after knight d6, bishop b6, bishop d6, black can't castle kingside, so he decides to just play it safe and go ahead and castle, which is the main move. Knight takes f6, knight takes f6. If they play with the bishop, then that allows the g-pawn to march. By taking with the knight, black controls the g4 square for the time being, but white plays knight to e5. Now that knight aids in control of the g4 square, the g-pawn can advance. Rook a to d8, placing the rook opposite the queen. Queen to e2, getting out of the x-ray pressure from the rook, and supporting a g4 pawn advance, and putting some pressure on e6, which turns out to be a pretty big deal. In this position, black should play knight to d5, hitting the bishop on f4, and after bishop c1, c5, which is the thematic move in this position. He goes ahead and plays c5 right here. Now, this move does make all the sense in the world. He wants to liquidate white's center, but it gets him in big trouble. Magnus plays the move knight to g6, which seems impossible. That square looks protected, but it turns out to take that knight leads to a very violent attack, which is actually unstoppable. As it turns out in this position, what black should have done was play rook f to e8, and after knight e7, rook e7, dc5, rook e d7, trade of one pair of rooks, bishop d6, b6, g4, bc5, bishop to e5. Now this position was analyzed at the time the game was played in 2004 as better for white. But modern computers see that after queen to d2, this is actually a very competitive game, and black is certainly at least equal here. But thankfully for us, Grandmaster Ernst took the knight, fg6, and now we get to see this beautiful attack. Queen takes e6 check. If black tries to interpose the rook, then pawn takes pawn, and that rook is lost. So king to h8, pawn takes pawn, and all of a sudden, look at these threats. Sacrifices on h6 with the bishop and the rook. The bishop at e7 is threatened. The queen controls the g8 square. Black is in big trouble. If he plays a move like, say, rook to d7, then after bishop h6, gh6, rook h6 check, king to g7, and doubling up rooks on this file, black is going to be lost. Black's best attempt here would be to play queen to d2, but after rook h7, king g6, g4, white threatens mate on f5. Black can defend with the rook, but then c4, hitting the rook, and then if queen to d3 with check, but also controlling that square with the queen, king to a1, there's nothing black can do here. He's lost. If he plays rook to g5, that just leaves right to mate. The other option is to play the rook back to d7, but this is actually a mate in 7, and it's all checks. You know, they say always check, it might be mate. That's kind of a joke, but here it really works. Check, king g5, queen e5 check. These are all forced. King g4, rook g7 check, king f3, rook g3 check, king f2, rook h2 check, king f1, rook h1, king f2, queen to e1, mate. So what does black do here? He plays knight to g8. That adds to the defense of the h6 pawn. It defends the bishop at e7. And h6 looks like it's sufficiently defended now. It isn't. And Magnus sacrifices on the h6 square. His opponent responds by taking with the g-pawn. If he takes with the knight, then rook h6, gh6, queen e7, and there is nothing black can do to stop mate on h7. He could sacrifice a couple of pieces, but eventually he's going to get mated. So Grandmaster Ernst takes with the g-pawn, then rook h6 check anyway. Knight h6, queen to e7. Now the mate on h7 is threatened, but black has this idea. Knight to f7. Now, here's something of a reveal, something of a twist. It turns out this entire game up to this point had already been played by two very strong players. Almagro Janos played Jan Gustafsson, who you may know from Chess24 fame, and Jan Gustafsson had the black pieces here, and the game ended up being a draw when white could not find the winning continuation. In that game, it went queen to f6, king to g8, rook h1, knight h6, queen e7, threatening the mate again. Then the knight goes back to f7. And they agreed to a draw in this position. But as it turns out, white is actually better here with the move rook to h3, threatening pawn takes knight, followed by rook to g3. If queen to d2, gf7, rook f7, rook g3 check, king h7, queen f7 leads to mate. And if knight to g5, rook h7 leads to a win. The knight can't retake the rook because queen would capture and it would be mate. But Magnus, who probably knew this position already, discovered a much clearer and easier win for white. The first thing he did was he took the knight with the pawn. Even though he's down a whole rook, his position is dominating. Black played king to g7, an alternative example of queen to b6, queen to e5 check, king h7, rook h1 check, and mate can't be stopped. King g6, rook to h5 with the threat of queen to f5 mate. If queen to f6, rook h6, king h6, queen f6, king h7, c3, and if rook to d5, g4 is coming. I said mate is inevitable, but this isn't a forced mate, but it is a forced win. That g-pawn cannot be stopped. King to g7, rook to d3, the rook lift. Coming in, the threat is rook to g3 check. The queen controls the e1 square, so there's no back rank mate from black. Rook to d6 to try to block the rook's check. Rook to g3, rook to g6, and this is a really pretty mating pattern. Queen to e5 check. Now, if black plays king to h7, then queen to h5, rook to h6, queen to f5, king to h8, then queen to e5, and then mate on g7 is unstoppable. So instead, black plays king takes f7, queen to f5 check, then rook to f6, and a very beautiful final mating position. Queen to d7 check mate. It's rare to give mate nowadays. I hope you liked this video. Click the like button if you did, and subscribe if you haven't already. And be sure to watch this next video. It's a really good one. It's a doozy. Please join us. Thank you for being here at Chess Talk. Goodbye.